otherwise, yes, you are here in this breakout room. We will give you an overview of what we did in the last years in the SMARTEES project. And now some more people are coming in, but I can see that at the moment we only have Ellen Mattis here as an external audience. Hello, Ellen. I hope there will be more of you joining and will be interested in the project. But in the start, I will give you an overview of the SMARTEES project, and I hope that within that time, more people will join. So the next maybe 10 minutes, I will tell you what the SMARTEES project is about and what the idea behind was and still is. So we still have half a year to go on the project. And then we will present in the next 90 minutes and in 90 minutes after the break, all the different facets of the work that we have done in this project. So the basic idea of the SMARTEES project was to put together the work around social innovation and especially social energy innovation with social simulation technologies and with stakeholder involvement in the development of social innovations in very concrete neighborhoods, cities, islands around Europe. So we took a case study approach to our methodology. So we studied a number of cases, and we did that by using methods from social innovation research, social simulation research, and then we had also a strong path of stakeholder involvement in the project. So we start with the case clusters, and I will in a minute give you an overview of what the different case clusters are and what the cases are. And then we put in the first part of the project, the social innovation analysis, what happened in the cases. And then in the next step, we developed social simulations of the processes that happened, which are now in the final stage of development. And then we involved stakeholders from the different cases to define alternative policy scenarios that we then analyzed in the social simulations to find out what could have happened in the cases if some of the conditions had been different. So all of that feeds into the casework that we do in the SMARTEES project. And then we have a number of objectives connected to that. So we will, in the end, give policy advice both at the local level and at the national and European level. We are developing a policy sandbox tool which visualizes and makes tangible some of the main findings from the social simulation work. We have a follower city web, which I will say a little bit more about in a second. And then we also contribute to method and theory development, both in the social innovation research literature, but also in the social simulation work. So we did quite a number of breakthroughs, I would say, in the social simulation approach of social innovations. I mentioned a number of times that we have case clusters, and what that means is that we put together two cases of very specific social energy innovations in 5 different clusters. So in each of the clusters we have here, we have 2 cases where this social innovation has happened already. One of them is more mature than the other one. And in these 2 cases, we analyzed how did that happen, what were the local peculiarities of this process, what can we learn from it, and how can we simulate this process in our social simulation approach. And the 5 different clusters that we had were the first one, holistic mobility plans, where cities worked with participatory and holistic mobility planning involving their citizens in that. And here we had the city of Groningen as one case and the city of Zurich in Switzerland as the other case. Then we had a case cluster on islands and renewable energy, where the rather well-known island of Samsø in Denmark was one of our cases, where we analyzed how they developed their regenerative energy production in the hands of the islanders. And then we also analyzed El Hierro in Spain as another case. And then we had the third case cluster, which is district regeneration, where we look at how to regenerate city districts that have a number of challenges, demographic challenges, but also challenges to the building infrastructure. And here we looked at two districts in Malmö and in Stockholm in Sweden. And then we have the fourth case, which is mobility in superblocks, which is more Southern European phenomenon, where you define parts of cities as a larger block, and within the block you mostly ban car traffic and make spaces available for people, for bicyclists, and so on. And here, Vitoria-Gasteiz in north of Spain is the front-runner case, and Barcelona in Spain is the second case where some superblocks have already been implemented, and we follow and analyzed how that worked. And then we have the last cluster, which is the energy efficiency against fuel poverty cluster, where we looked particularly at Aberdeen, where a district heating network was developed with a very special focus, which you will learn more on later. And Timișoara in Romania was the second case here, which is following the ideas of Aberdeen and learning a lot from Aberdeen. But in each of these cases, we also have a network of around 4 to 5 follower cities or follower islands who, during the project, were at several points involved in learning from the frontrunner cases, visiting them, sharing their ideas, discussing what can we transfer from what has been done there to our particular situation. So on the next slide, you see how they spread over Europe. And the almost last thing that I wanted to say to you as an introduction is that, of course, early in the process of the project, we needed to define what we understand as a social energy innovation. And we built our SMARTEES definition of social energy innovation on already existing definitions of social innovation, but we tweaked it a bit, and what you can see on screen here is our definition of a social innovation in the energy transition, which is a process of change in social relationships, interactions, configurations, and or the sharing of knowledge leading to or based on new environmentally sustainable ways to producing, managing, and consuming energy that meet social challenges or problems. And how we ended up with that definition, you can hear a bit more about in our next presentation, so I won't say much more now. These are the partners involved in the project. So we have a number of scientific partners here, but we also have user partners, and then we have the city partners or the island partners that are also spread around this map here. For the structure of the two sessions, we will have this next or this time slot here to give you an overview about the social innovation research we did in the project and the development of policy scenarios and so on. So we will have a presentation about social support as a key driver for social innovation, what we learned from the analysis of our cases, fostering citizen acceptability and empowerment, where we analyzed like the key social dynamics that happened in the cases before we go into identification of drivers and barriers for social innovation and urban mobility, a specific analysis of some of our cases, and then look at like a little side project within SMARTEES where we analyze data on bicycling across Europe, and because that was important for many of our cases, and there we will present the results of that as the end of this session. And hopefully after that we still have some time for questions and discussions before we take a coffee break and then go into the second part of the SMARTEES session, where we look at drivers and barriers of energy innovations in neighborhoods, other cases analyzed in more detail, and then we switch into the social simulation part of SMARTEES, where we will present to you some of our agent-based models that we used and developed, and some of the first analysis that we have here. We will talk about how very complex cases, some of them have 40 years of history, how we bake them into very specific social simulations, agent-based models. And then we will, or Gary will present the dynamics of trust in decisions, how that could be simulated in relation to one of our cases. And then we end on a hopefully entertaining note with a presentation how you can probably present the results of such complex simulations and complex analysis in an engaging way by, for example, using improvisation theater or dancers to show you how social organization works and how the dynamics work here. So that is the plan for the rest of the morning. And with that being said, I hand over to the first presenter, which is Gabriele Quinti. And please, Gabriele.
Thank you, Christian. You said me that it is impossible to share my screen. Perhaps you have to authorize me, or you use the presentation what I sent you.
The plan is that I've put together all the presentations for everyone, so I will just click.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, the presentation is on. Start with the context of energy transition as a social issue. But energy transition is not only a technical issue but also a social issue, taking into account some profound transformation in contemporary society. For instance, the fact that energy issues are in the agenda of a lot of people. There is an increased circulation of knowledge and information. The people are concerned by energy issue. And also that according to the increasing standard of life, people is more interested in energy issue. Therefore, the issue is not only technical, but also social. Go ahead. This is the definition of social innovation already presented by Christian 2 minutes ago. Social innovation in energy transition is a process of change in social relationship, interaction, configuration, and the sharing of knowledge leading to based new environmental sustainable ways of producing, managing, and consuming energy that meet social challenges and problems. And take into account this definition of social innovation already presented by Christian before, it is absolutely clear that actors are central for allowing social innovation, and therefore gaining a large social support is a key driver for social innovation in energy transition. Which actors? There is a multiplicity of actors involved in energy transition. First, of course, public actors. Often public actors are linked to local authorities in our cases, but there are also many national and regional governments, in a certain sense also international actors are involved in energy transition. For instance, the European Commission, interregional and regional organization, etc. Therefore, there is a first set of actors that are the public actors. Second, we have the energy system, energy facilities, and all the other actors involved in the energy system. And then we have a third category of actors that perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago were not so engaged in the energy sector, but now with energy transition, they are involved in the process. From NGOs, CSOs, environmental movement, scientific community, enterprises, up to the citizen that are each day more active in energy-related issues, for instance, also becoming prosumers in the, therefore also involved in the production of energy. The SMARTEES empirical basis is, as was already presented by Christian, the 5 clusters that Christian mentioned before. 2 clusters are concentrated, are centered on mobility, on the problem of mobility, of energy transition related to the improvement of mobility alternatives. Then we have 2 clusters, the 2 islands linked to renewable energy efficiency and to the for getting the energy independences of this island. Then the problem of district regeneration projects, and finally the energy efficiency measures for in building, in particular, for fighting fuel poverty. Well, this was the first part of the presentation. Now we go in the core of the presentation, that is to present the strategies that we found in these 10 cases that I mentioned before for gaining social support. We can group these strategies for gaining social support in 4+1 sets. The 4 sets are strong and the large involvement of collective actors and citizens, the importance of negotiation among the actors, the construction of a new cognitive dimension at the territorial level, and take into account that in these cases local authorities play a central role in leading the social innovation process, the energy transition process, and also social innovation. There is a need of a specific internal change in the public sector. Therefore, and then after 5 set is a residual set that are further operational options. We can go with the first set. The first set is a strong and enlarged involvement of collective actors and citizens. The first and perhaps the most important strategy is the involvement of a large set of actors in the decision-making process. That is to go from a situation where only actors of energy system or public actors are involved to a large involvement in decision-making process, including partnership with all the kind of actors or almost all the kind of actors that I mentioned before. Then second possibility is the sharing of knowledge, that is to consider that also in each territory there is knowledge that could be useful for facilitating energy transition, and therefore we have to valorize the knowledge of each one of actors that can be involved. And all the knowledge coming from the actor at the territorial level and the knowledge coming from all the other actors should be shared in each case, but also among the cases, taking into account the lesson learned from the other case. Then a third line is a credible and constant communication among the actors involved. Communication that should be 2 ways as far as possible, therefore not only communication among, for instance, local authorities and citizens, but also communication from citizen to the local authority. Then a 5th line is transparency, that is all the things that are done, including issues related to financial issues, should be as far as possible open access and shared by all the actors involved. A 5th line is a cultural sensitivity in promoting energy transition, taking into account that thanks also to the globalization process, in our communities we have a large set of factors, so we have also people, but perhaps coming from immigrants, for instance. Therefore, there is a problem of translation in different languages, perhaps also to involve a cultural mediator, and perhaps more important, take into account the different groups' perspective, the perspective of different groups of citizens. And from this, we arrive to the second, please arrive in the second set, that is negotiation, that is take into account that we have this large set of factors involved. There is the need of a constant negotiation among these different actors, because these different actors often bear different perspectives, and these different perspectives are not always convergent. Therefore, we have to negotiate among different perspectives for trying to build a consensus among the actions that should be implemented. Then we have some examples. For instance, in the case of Groningen, shopkeepers and their association at the beginning of the process were against the change in the mobility pattern, and later, also thanks to dialogue and confrontation, often they changed their attitude, and some of them now support the changes that characterize the mobility in Groningen. The same thing for car drivers association in Zurich, or we can have also the problems of elder for disabled people that, for instance, in Zurich were involved in a decision among the places where we have to place the tram, the tramways, etc. Station of the state, the railway station, etc., for being more suitable for their personal mobility. Environmental movement also in some cases were against the activities that were promoted by local authorities, and later they were involved and changed their attitude. But this was not didn't happen in one day. It happened thanks a very long and articulated process of negotiation, also for understanding and preventing conflict, or where conflict arise, for instance, in the case of shopkeepers in Groningen, to manage this conflict. Go ahead. The third set is build a new cognitive dimension. For instance, consider the experience of a city, of a neighborhood, or an island as a pleasant, friendly, clean, and accessible places. For instance, an environmental district or something like that. Also, so very, very important also to consider the symbolic dimension. For instance, the celebration of the new identity of neighborhood, or for instance, to have the symbolic street signpost, or to institutionalize environmental weeks, cleaning days, bike days, etc. Through this kind of action, we construct a new cognitive dimension, and people can share this cognitive dimension, and could be more involved in the implementation of action related to the energy transition. Therefore, we have the generation of more easier generation of pro-environmental behaviors among citizens and the other relevant actors. Again, the fourth set, as I said before, local authorities are central in the leading of the energy transition at the local level. Therefore, we need to take into account the existence of this large set of actors that are to be involved. There is the need of a change of the way of working of people in public administrations. These are some examples, going beyond the professional pattern standard to adopt a frequent permanent attitude to dialogue, facilitating negotiation. This is not was not quite often in the public administration. Going beyond the formal level through frequent, also informal dialogue, informal contacts, also friendly contacts. For instance, it was very important in Zurich. In Zurich, we have the case that both the canton of Zurich and the municipality of Zurich are involved in the mobility change. The canton is characterized by a type of political majority that was completely different from the political majority of the municipality. Therefore, there is a sort of conflict among the two levels, the canton level and the municipality level, and the informal contact among the technicians from both municipality and canton were very important for going ahead in the process of social innovation. The change of patterns in the way of working, the recognizing of the bottom level of administration, and cooperation among the different bodies. For instance, the example that I gave before with the canton of the municipality, the case of Zurich. Go ahead. And then there are some other options, proceeding step by step, avoiding radical measure, give priority to pull measure over push measure, the cities and ownership of renewable energy, and so on. There are further operational options that are very important for gaining a consensus from the different set of actors. Go ahead. For concluding, it is I think clear at this moment that getting a larger social support is a key driver for social innovation, and taking into account the large number of actors involved, we need a multi-actor approach, and at the core of the whole process is the negotiation among the different perspectives, among the different actors, for avoiding conflict and for building a stronger consensus. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriele, for your introduction to what we did or what we found when we analyzed the processes that happened in our different cases. And we will go on with an analysis of the cases, which is presented by Adina Dumitru. Adina, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. I think those were very good introductions to what I'm going to speak about on what we found further on fostering citizen acceptability and empowerment in energy-related social innovations. The project, as Christian was saying at the beginning, has now gone through many stages, but what I will present here is the result of a series of qualitative interviews that show some of the social dynamics that are relevant in processes of innovation. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So first of all, a bit about our approach to social innovation. Christian mentioned the definition we use in the transit project, in the SMARTEES project, and I want to give a little bit of a background of where this comes from. So in a previous project, which was a transit project, we made efforts to develop a definition of social innovation and also of transformative social innovation. And we define social innovation as a change in social relations, which involves new ways of doing, organizing, framing, and/or knowing. And to differentiate this from transformative social innovation, because we assume that not all social innovation is going to be transformative, we define transformative social innovation as those social innovations that end up challenging, altering, or replacing dominant institutions. Institutions understood in the sense of both formal and informal institutions. So we're not here speaking only about formal institutions. One important element here when we talk about social innovation is that we are trying to explain change. We are trying to explain how especially transformative change happens and what is the role of innovation and especially of social innovation in those kinds of processes of change. And when we talk about transformative change, we do not think of that as a linear phenomenon. So that is not something that happens only as a result of social innovation, but as a result of what we call co-evolutionary interactions between, on the one hand, changing paradigms and mental models. So the idea that people with time will develop a new perspective and a new paradigm, a new understanding of what is normal. For example, in this case, in the energy domain and in their own behaviors. But also changes in political institutions, physical structures, and innovative developments on the ground. What we mean by this is actually that with innovations that have a history of so many years, as we are discussing here, obviously, other elements of the background and of the context are constantly changing as well. And so it is within these complex interactions between the social innovation itself and the changing background, the changing context, as a result of other factors, that social innovation might become successful or not. So, as we can see from this, is a really complex process. And what we tried to do in SMARTEES is adopt a place-oriented and context-dependent perspective of social innovation in the energy domain, thinking and understanding that actually the way you understand these phenomena, the best way to understand them is at the local level. And understanding the peculiarities of each local context, and considering that social innovations, although they might be ideas that arise not on global level sometimes or in many different locations at the same time, they are also locally embedded phenomena, and their significance is contingent upon other broader changes in the context, as I was saying before, because the context and the mental paradigms are also changing as a result of other phenomena. So we are conceiving of these processes of social innovation as highly dynamic. They are highly porous as well. They are connecting to longer-term trajectories, social trajectories also, but also the trajectories of the initiatives we study. And they occur through a diversity of social processes, but we are optimistic enough to think that we can infer a set of common patterns that can help us understand some of the characteristics of how these processes actually lead to acceptability and to a successful change towards sustainability. Next slide, please. So our more specific objective was also to understand how we achieve this citizen acceptability, understood as a general evaluation of an energy program or of an energy policy. And our objective was to identify processes and dynamics that actually predictably lead to social acceptability or to indifference and active opposition. So we saw that in histories of social innovation, you can see all those phenomena happening at different stages, and we wanted to understand what determines one outcome or the other. We also wanted to understand what is the role of empowerment of individual citizen and also community empowerment. And we conceptualized empowerment as the process through which human actors gain the capacity, but also the willingness to mobilize resources to achieve their goals. We developed a model of empowerment in a previous project as well, where we define empowerment based on a set of basic psychological needs. So we think that people are empowered when these needs are satisfied through the process of social innovation, but also at the same time when they experience both individually and collectively a sense of impact, a sense of meaning, and develop resilience in developing a project that is socially innovative. Next slide, please. This is an explanation of the model and the dimensions of the model. As I just mentioned, we rely on self-determination theory to talk about basic psychological needs that people have, relatedness, autonomy, competence, and how these needs are satisfied at the level of local projects, which always entail new social relations, so the establishment of new groups and new communities, but also how these new groups and communities achieve a sense of impact, a sense of meaning, and a sense of resilience. Next slide, please. So we used a partly embedded case design as a methodology by looking, as Christian mentioned, at different cases that illustrate one cluster, which is different from a holistic case design because it allows us to look at different levels of analysis. On the one hand, at the case level was, so the city or the island was the main unit of analysis in our project. But we also look at, as it will be discussed later in presentations, the replicability of the model to different locations. And this helps us to kind of flexibly deal with the appropriate level of analysis that sometimes is not evident at the start of the research when we talk about such porous social phenomena. Next slide, please. So in this case, we talk about in the results I will talk about refer to two clusters. On the one hand, the cluster of urban mobility with superblocks, where we studied the case of Vitoria-Gasteiz in Barcelona in Spain, and the cluster of energy efficiency against fuel poverty in Timișoara. Next, please. So just a few words about superblocks. Superblocks foster are a project, as it was mentioned already, that foster low carbon mobility by reorganizing urban space with the objective of actually freeing up space for other social uses that allow for new forms of recreation, new forms of community activities, and kind of improving the aesthetics and the quality of urban place and urban space. And next slide, please. The model of fighting energy poverty through energy efficiency in Timișoara, as costs were an issue in the city for a significant proportion of inhabitants, costs of energy were an issue. They developed a program by which, through collaborations between public authorities, supply companies, and civil society organizations, they developed a series of measures to fight fuel poverty that were tailored to the characteristics of the city and of particular communities within the city. Next slide, please. So these are the interviews we carried out in these 3 case studies. So you can see that we have 12 interviews in Vitoria-Gasteiz, Barcelona, and 6 interviews in Timișoara. These are a total of 30 in-depth semi-structured interviews where we studied the factors and dynamics influencing social acceptability, but also the factors influencing resistance and contestation. And within these interviews, within this series of interviews, we included promoters of the project, supporters of the project, and also opponents. So a few critical voices, representatives of associations that were actually against the project. So in terms of the results, we have some results that are common to both projects and some that are particular. You can see here also by the, we report the groundedness so that you can see which codes are actually very central. So in the case of superblocks, we see that the importance of community engagement in decision-making processes appears as a key factor. It is actually even today in the debates that are taking place in Victoria and also in Barcelona, that although citizens are mostly in favor of the superblock model, they still, when they still have a but, when they say, I agree, but I would like to have a more power of decision-making, I would like to be more involved in deciding exactly the shape of the superblock in particular neighborhood. So we can see that this is a really important factor. From the beginning of the project, so with these long trajectories, it also came, we also found that it's actually very important to involve citizens from the beginning and avoid the top-down policies. In the case of Victoria, for example, the project was perceived as a bit more top-down than in the case of Barcelona, where actually one of the first superblocks, the superblock of Poblenou, was started by the community. So it was a bottom-up approach and was initially slightly ignored by the city council. This code also refers to meaningful involvement. So there's a desire for citizens to be involved in ways that actually make a difference. And in some of the successful cases have actually established procedures through which particular concerns are taken into account. Barcelona has actually been quite excellent in that sense, because they have established a system by which during the first 2 years of the project, they actually answered in writing or in workshops to any particular concern that any citizen involved in the process had. So they took this very tailored approach. The second important factor is having good dissemination, communication, and education strategies that use a variety of means. And what we found through this process is that actually sometimes the dissemination and communication strategies are targeted to only particular needs or particular dimensions and benefits of the social innovation, such as environmental quality, for example, and they ignore others that are equally important. For example, the importance of having a certain level of comfort, the importance of prestige of the city, or the importance of well-being and the quality of the new spaces that is being achieved with the superblocks. So we found that this is actually something that through the process of social innovation, city councils learn a lot about how to do this better, and they develop more creative strategies as they go along. Another important factor has to do with making change easy. So this stage-based approach, where measures are communicated step by step, and also citizens are prepared to assume those changes based on what we very well know as a psychological principle that sometimes people are reluctant to sudden and drastic changes. So making that change as easy as possible has been an important factor. This also has a bit of limitations because, for example, Victoria has opted for doing that in a way that did not present the superblock model from the beginning, but actually presented it as a series of different policies of mobility that were associated to the superblock model. And actually, they still see that today, some people do not see all those, for example, public transport restructuring policies as part of the superblock model. So there's a bit of a problem around that. While Barcelona has opted from the beginning for presenting the entire project as such, as a holistic project, and made change easy by making any of the policies that they've and projects they have implemented on the ground reversible, temporary, and then helping and then allowing citizens to decide whether they wanted to keep that or they wanted to go back to a previous project. This is related also to pilot projects, so the importance of having very good pilot projects where citizens can experience the social innovation and can experience the benefits of it. And this has been the case in both cities. They both have had really good pilot projects, which then led to a very high level of acceptability. Celebrating new identities, as you can see, is not so important in Victoria, but has been very important in Barcelona, and it has to do with their bottom-up approach. And negotiation and mediation to gain consensus is very important. And again, having these targeted communication strategies to particular groups. Next slide. In the case of Timișoara, you can see that some of the factors are very common, but a lot more emphasis is placed on the importance of developing meaningful interpersonal relations, especially in order to gain trust of communities that are disenfranchised. Making sure that empowerment is taken into account because they are dealing with vulnerable groups, and that an empathetic approach to energy poverty is taken. Next slide. Finally, in terms of social dynamics influencing citizen empowerment, we can also see that important factors had to do with the changes in the quality of relations. And what we mean by this is actually that the positive feeling of being part of a group, if we achieve that, that's one important element of empowerment. And also at the same time, the importance of support, both institutional support, but also in support of all political actors, has been a very important cause or either empowerment or disempowerment. For example, in Barcelona, as the initiative was started from the bottom up, at certain moments, the interviewees declared that they felt very alone because political structure at the time, the government was ignoring their efforts for a long time. Another important dimension has to do with developing competence and mastery. So developing the skills, abilities, and knowledge, both to participate in the process, but also to actually make full use of the social innovation. So, for example, this includes some very specific programs, such as developing safety in biking, for example, and also learning to gain influence and maintain influence over the political process. I will round up very soon. So gaining a sense of meaning has been very important as well. a sense of impact and meaning, feeling proud of their involvement. So if citizens get to feel proud of their involvement in DSI and celebrate their involvement, as well as receiving acknowledgement and public recognition for involvement and for the social innovation, what they achieved through it, is very important element. Can we go to the last slide? Thank you. So just as by way of conclusion, we can see that top-down policies are always perceived as impositions, as we know, and participatory approaches all along are really important. Enabling context for meaningful participation is important because we see that although in some cases it looks like participation, it's actually more one-directional communication between the government and some representatives that are not of the community, but not a wider involvement of citizens. Allowing time for these processes is sometimes perceived as frustrating by the promoters, but it pays off in the long term. And when they haven't done so, they had to go back and do it. And we can also see that through these social innovations, we can build upon citizens' engagement to these solutions. They actually become better. And also that empowered communities develop a sense of collective responsibilities or collective responsibility over the project in the neighborhood, and this leads to more innovative solutions in the future. Thank you very much. And sorry for going a bit over time.
Thank you, Adina, and thank you for the nice insight into 3 of our cases. So we just continue with Patricia Albulescu, who will continue the presentation of findings from the analysis of our cases.
Yes, thank you. Hello, I'm Patricia Albulescu, and I will present in the following team effort in the identification of drivers and barriers for social innovation in urban mobility in SMARTEES project case studies. Urban expansion and high dependence on cars as a mode of transportation already led to congestion in cities across Europe, raising issues such as competitiveness, social cohesion, and sustainable growth. Therefore, there is a pressing need to find sustainable solutions for efficient urban mobility by minimizing environmental and health impacts, particularly in densely populated areas. As a response to these issues, local decision makers, transport authorities, and citizens are looking for innovative solutions to meet the societal challenges and environmental constraints in order to deliver integrated transport policies and to make the best use of all transport modes in the urban network. This is the case for 4 European cities under study: Zurich from Switzerland, Groningen in the Netherlands, and Vitoria-Gasteiz and Barcelona, both from Spain, experimenting with new socially and environmentally sustainable ways of urban mobility. In Zurich and Groningen, the mobility plan is used as a way to mobilize and coordinate many societal actors, different branches of local authorities, citizens, constructors, transport companies, and so forth, building towards the common goal of a more sustainable and efficient city transport system. In Vitoria-Gasteiz and Barcelona, an urban innovation superblocks is introducing low-carbon mobility practices through the organization of urban space, minimizing the use of motorized modes of transport. All 4 cases have a long history behind their respective social innovations and are still ongoing. The 4 different approaches offer valuable insights and good practices on how social innovations in urban mobility can be developed and replicated. We can draw from their experience and analyze what factors must be taken into consideration which have the possibility to hinder or to enhance it. First of all, we define what we mean by social innovation in the SMARTEES project, a definition already discussed in depth during last presentations. Second, we acknowledge the distinction between factors that can function in a positive way as drivers or in a negative way as barriers, thus either hindering or facilitating urban mobility social innovations. Based on Stern's value belief norm theory, we propose 4 main categories of barriers and drivers and the subsequent elements. Relevant variables hypothesized to influence environmental relevant behavior: attitudinal factors, capabilities and resources, contextual factors, as well as habit and routines. The data is cross-sectional, gathered in one point of time. Researchers responsible for each case worked closely with key actors in identifying the entities involved and the relationships between them, providing information about drivers and barriers related to social innovation for each case, how relevant they are, how strongly they act, and how strong is their effect. All this information is useful to highlight the implications of factors which could impact environmentally significant behaviors. The number of actors involved in each social innovation differs from city to city, where Zurich gathered around the urban mobility plan over 20 different key actors from the municipality to several citizenship groups, whereas in the Groningen case, a total of 8 key actors are involved, from shopkeepers associations to public transport organizations. Them that facilitates a deeper understanding of social innovation. Factors identified in both cities as the drivers for urban mobility social innovation are general environmental predisposition, financial resources, social norms and expectations, and supporting policies. Also, if the social innovation can ensure the safety of pedestrians and cyclists, then a tendency towards acceptability was observed. Moreover, benefits such as improved cycling infrastructure or environment quality are valued higher than the costs, such as time or effort. Nonetheless, business actors driven by financial motivations consider restricting access for cars to city centers as a threat to their businesses, making these actors initially resistant. Laws and regulations as contextual factors are perceived rather as barriers for social innovation than drivers. Interestingly, the exception comes from Zurich residents who consider this a facilitating factor. The general perception among the majority of actors, regardless of their specificity of their activity, is that material costs act as a barrier to the implementation of social innovation. In both Spanish cases, Vitoria-Gasteiz and Barcelona, social innovations involve less actors, 3 and 4 respectively. Similar to the previous cases, pro-environmental attitudes act as a driver. The belief of the social actors that they can be competent partners in the debates about urban mobility, that they can achieve results increasing the well-being of the people and strengthen the environmental identity of the city, the preservation of traditions, the concern for the climate change and air quality, or the perception that the quality of the urban space is important for citizens' safety and well-being, act as facilitators. Changes at the level of social norms is perceived as a drive because green solutions such as cycling are embraced by an increasing number of people, such as youth, public employees, or policymakers. Supportive policies are very important not only for the beginning of the implementation, but also for the behavioral change associated with it. Sometimes the regional or metropolitan context, not just the local one, becomes an important factor. The lack of financial and human resources has been pointed out as a barrier to social innovation. Time is also perceived as a barrier because engaging in participatory processes is a time-consuming activity. Overall, on all 4 cases under analysis, the attitudinal factors are mostly playing a facilitating role, as more drivers were identified here than barriers. General environmentalist predisposition is seen as a driver in all the cases, being related to experience in developing an environmental project, environmental awareness, and collaboration between various stakeholders. Behavior-specific norms and beliefs represent a driver for most of the actors involved in Zurich, Groningen, and Vitoria-Gasteiz, whereas in Barcelona the situation is more nuanced. On this factor, in Zurich case, when mobility is perceived as a public space problem, it acts as a facilitator or even as a motivator for further action. The support and development of a holistic traffic planning vision with a focus at the inner city from a multifunctional perspective, motivation to involve citizens in planning processes, as well as the belief in democracy, were identified as drivers in Groningen case. In Vitoria-Gasteiz, the number of citizens which use bikes for transport will increase if there are improvements at the infrastructure level, act as drivers. In Barcelona, commitments related to environmental and societal challenges for reducing the impact of air pollution on citizens' health act as drivers, whereas the belief that the traffic prohibitions will jeopardize commercial activity is a barrier for some key actors. Unsurprisingly, personal capabilities and resources play a different role, either as a driver or a barrier in each case, varying among the type of actors. Literacy, knowledge, and skills and human relations factors were perceived more negatively, as some very specific skills are missing in Zurich. In Groningen and Vitoria-Gasteiz, these factors mostly act as drivers, being related to long-term experience in city planning, ability to create coalitions and lobby, empathy, co-designing processes, and individuals with very high skills and motivations being involved in the social innovation. Whereas social status is not important for other three cases, in Groningen acts mostly as a driver. Financial resources represent a more nuanced factor, considered mostly a driver in Zurich and Groningen. In Vitoria-Gasteiz, only one actor considers this a barrier, even if external funds were secured later in the development of the social innovation. In Barcelona, this factor is considered mainly as a barrier, as the lack of local budget for investments and infrastructures for human resources have been pointed out as a limitation for launching more superblocks in new city areas and could impose some delays in the execution of the superblock action plan. Material costs and rewards, laws and regulations, supportive policies, social norms and expectations, and media reports are the contextual factors considered in this analysis. Two such factors relevant for the cases under study emerged. In Zurich and Groningen, of importance is direct democracy, which can either act as a barrier if can entail some delay in action, for example, due to waiting for referenda results, or a driver, being an incentive for action. Metropolitan and regional context is of relevance for Vitoria-Gasteiz and Barcelona cities, acting rather as a barrier than a driver related to public transportation infrastructure and services limitations. Overall, habits and routines are generally of limited relevance in all four cities, but may act as a barrier when undesirable behaviors are considered, such as general resistance to change, as in Zurich and Groningen, the habits sidewalks contributing to frictions between the two groups, as in Vitoria-Gasteiz, or using private cars for moving in and outside the city instead of other modes of transport in Barcelona. Urban mobility, social innovations are complex, gathering under one common goal various different actors with complex systems and policy to be taken into consideration. One step to disentangle these complexities is for upscaling or replication purposes across EU cities is to refer to those already existing social innovations and to evaluate the factors which could influence their success. Our analysis did just so. Some of these insights are the basis on which recommendation can be built that decision makers could take into account when aiming at introducing social innovation in the mobility field. A first such recommendation pertains to the pro-environmental attitudes identified mostly as drivers in this analysis for the vast majority of actors. This means that no matter which type of actor it is, NGO, administration, citizen, business, it is likely that more environmentally engaged people are more likely to drive social innovation process. For this reason, we recommend that policies interested in making the social innovations easier for people to accept take advantage of this pro-environmental attitude, refer to environmental values when initiating the process, liaise with societal groups with strong environmental engagement, or to develop environmental engagement before introducing innovative solutions. A common risk is that business actors manifest some resistance in accepting greener alternatives of mobility because they see this as a threat to their own, but can be lessened later in the process. Thus, it is recommended that policies intending to stimulate social perceptions of business owners. Furthermore, implementing mobility changes as trials with an option to go back if they are not successful is a good way of addressing initial skepticism. Our third and final recommendations is to remove ambiguities and uncertainties in regulations, create room for experimental solutions, and design policies which can amplify the output of social innovations in mobility sector. This is all that we can say for now. So thank you. If there are any questions.
Yes, thank you, Patricia. And again, the reminder, if you have any questions or things you would like to ask our presenters, please post them in the chat. After the next presentation, we will have approximately 15 minutes to discuss and to answer questions. But first, we go to the final presentation of this first part. Please, Ryan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan O'Reilly, and myself and my colleagues at the Energy Institute, Andrea Coleman, Jed Cohen, and Johannes Reichel, have been working on this project, Social Innovations in Personal Biking Mobility, the Factors Driving Bicycle Usage in Europe. And we're actually going to wrap up this project in drafted publication soon, so any comments are very welcomed. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about this too much because it's actually a really nice transition from Patricia's discussion. As you very well know, personal transport is a very large environmental concern. Personal vehicles have seen increased efficiency over the years, but a lot of this efficiency gain has been offset by increased ownership of personal vehicles and decreased occupancy of these vehicles. Additionally, given the fact that 60% of the global population is expected to live in urban areas, the issues that we currently see are expected to be exacerbated and even have additional demand for infrastructure like roads, parking lots, which has their own environmental externalities. So the takeaway is we need to change the way that we're moving and try to get people to switch towards bicycles or other modes of transport like public transportation. Now, the research shows that mobility choices are determined by intentional, situational, and habitual factors, including personal norms and social norms, and additionally, the socioeconomic situation. Next slide, please. All right, so what is the global research question here? It is how transferable is the social innovation process that led Scandinavia in the Netherlands to be the bike capital of Europe? Additionally, we have specific research questions. Can we identify structural characteristics that will inhibit or promote the uptake of bikes across Europe, such as weather, pollution, elevation change? Additionally, can we say anything about the relative effects and individual factors, structural factors, and national cultures in driving bicycle usage? And this is actually what I aim to talk a bit about today. All right, so how did we do this? The data comes from the ECHO's Horizon 2020 project, which surveyed 15,000 respondents from 31 different countries. And I think this is actually what really sets this project away from other projects that try to analyze biking behavior, is the scope. There's 31 different countries in our analysis. So our dependent variable was based on the question presented before you. So we had respondents, please choose the answer that best describes their bicycle use. So A, I almost never go to work via a bike. I rarely go to work via a bike. I sometimes go to work, and then I usually go to work in the warm season. I usually go to work in the winter season on a bike, and then I usually use a bike to go to work all the time. So we use this question to separate into two models. So one representing the biking decision for the summer season, and one representing the biking decision in the winter season. So for the summer season, if an individual indicated they only used the bike in the winter season, they would get a 0. And conversely, in the winter season, if the individual said they only use the bike in the summer season, they would get it a 0. And if you could go to the next slide, this shows the distribution of the dependent variable. So in the summer season, we see that about 3,000 people out of the 15,000 sample use a bike all the time for work and shopping mobility. We see this number decrease by about 1,000 in the winter season. Okay, so now we're going to show this spatially. And no surprise here, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark are the countries that bike the most. And while we see Portugal and Spain, the UK and Ireland are some of the countries that bike the least across Europe. Now, how are we going to describe the decision to bike? And that's what we're going to show you now. And this presents our list of independent variables or covariates. And we actually separated these into 3 categories. So the first set, from age to completed university, is the socio-demographic variables. And then we go into these really important variables, which are the personal norm variables that we've been talking about a lot today. So I'm going to talk about these a little bit right here. So obliged. So this covariate represents a 1 if the respondent feels a personal obligation to be energy efficient. And if you look in the right column, you see our expected signs. So we expect this to be positive, with a positive influence on the decision to bike all the time. Right below that, we see this variable called environment pro, or ENV pro, which is a 1 if the respondent self-reports as an environmentalist. Again, we expect this to have a strong positive effect on the decision to bike. Now, below this, so from Greenland to the bottom, we see these variables that represent structural characteristics. So characteristics that are out of the individual's hands, such as the number of public transit stops in the area, whether or not public transit's available in the person's area, pollution amount, temperature, the amount of rainfall, and then at the end here, the last 3, we see mean elevation, standard deviation of elevation, and then biking infrastructure. So just to clarify something, standard deviation of elevation would represent the hilliness of the area that a respondent's from. And we would expect that, as an area becomes more hilly, it becomes more challenging to bike, which could influence people to bike less. So we would expect that to have a negative relationship. Additionally, the last variable, we see bike infrastructure. Now, this represents the number of kilometers within a 10-kilometer radius of an individual's zip code's centroid that is dedicated to biking. So this is the amount of infrastructure in a given area that only can be used by a bike. And we expect this to have a positive effect. Okay, so now these are the results. And what we see is for our socio-demographic variable, we see that age does have a significant negative effect. So as individuals get older, they're less likely to bike all the time. Additionally, across the summer and winter panels, we see that males are more likely to bike than their female counterparts. Additionally, we see that the amount of money an individual makes per month, as it increases, actually decreases the likelihood of biking all the time. And those have a relatively strong effect. But as we go into the personal norm variables, so obliged and environmental pro, we see that these effects actually become larger, and they're significant at the 1% level. So these appear to be a major influence on individuals' decisions to bike. And this is something that Patricia mentioned before as a major driver of the mobility choices of people, which is something that we've found too. Now, something that is a bit surprising is the marginal impact that we see from these structural variables. So from Greenland to the biking infrastructure, only some of them are significant, and the ones that are significant actually have a very weak relationship with the decision to bike all the time. So specifically, the number of tram stops, which is significant across the panels, has very high significance, but has a very low impact on the decision to bike all the time. Again, temperature in the summer, temperature is actually not significant in the winter panel, we see that has a negative relationship. So as the average temperature in summer increases, the likelihood of someone biking all the time decreases. However, this is a very small effect that we're finding. Additionally, when you look at mean elevation, we see a very similar story. So it's significant and it's negative. So as an individual lives in an area that it has a higher elevation, it is expected to decrease the likelihood of them biking all the time. However, it is a very small effect. And then lastly, which was a variable that we found that we actually expected to have a very strong effect, is biking infrastructure. And again, it has a positive relationship with the dependent variable, which was expected. However, its impact is quite small. So as you can see right here, these country fixed effects, there's dots right here. So they were included in our probit model to model this biking decision. However, they were suppressed just for a concise model. So I'm going to show you those fixed effects right now at the next slide. And all of these effects were significant at the 1% level. So highly significant, and actually had a very high coefficient, which is represented at these odds ratios and the colors of the map. It is important to note that for our fixed effects, our reference country was the Netherlands. So what these maps are showing are these the locally embedded phenomenon that Adina mentioned that separates these countries from the Netherlands, and of course the other effects that our variables did not account for. And the colors represent, as they become lighter, they represent a greater difference from the referenced country, the Netherlands. And what we see is that comparing the summer panel to the winter panel, we actually see a larger difference of these fixed effects that separate one country from the Netherlands in the winter decision to bike than in the summer decision to bike, which is an interesting result in our opinion. Okay, so now to wrap this all up, the individual factors such as environmentalism, income, and living situation appear to be strong drivers influencing the biking decision across Europe. Interestingly, the structural factors are less influential than hypothesized, such as the built environment, urban living, bike lanes, geography, weather, pollution. Though some of them were significant, they only showed a very slight effect on the decision to bike all the time. Now, these national cultures, which we believe are captured in these fixed effects, are likely the strong drivers of bicycle ridership. And we believe this is a perfect place for social innovation, and believes supports evidence that social innovation is needed to duplicate the process of bike normalization and acceptance that is seen in Scandinavia and the Netherlands all over Europe. Additionally, we think SMARTEES ABM models can help us do this with insights into the Groningen case of bike uptake that might be able to be applied to these other countries. So that is all I had prepared today. Please stay in touch with me or my colleagues at the Energy Institute, and we welcome all comments.
Thank you, Ryan, for this interesting analysis. So we have now come to an end of the first section of presentations. Before we go into the discussion, for which we have about 15 minutes, I would like to advertise the final conference of the SMARTEES project, where you will have an even better chance to learn about the cases. So we will have case representatives presenting their cases in the conference. We will go more in depth into the different aspects that we just touched upon today. So if you're interested in this, we are having our final conference in September, and it will, fingers crossed, be a hybrid event where you have the opportunity to visit us in person in Groningen. But also, if you don't want to, or if you are not able to, then there is an online streaming of this conference. But now I would like to ask all the presenters of this morning session to switch on their cameras and be available for questions from the audience. And while we are waiting for questions from the audience, I would like to ask them to all of you. And that question is, we've seen now in the SMARTEES project and in the presentations today that an important part of these social innovations, and for that they are able to blossom in a city or in a on an island, we need to have this dialogue between the different partners. We need to involve citizens here. We need to make sure that we develop new ways of negotiating and so on. At the same time, we are now living in the COVID pandemic, where we have the exact opposite. So we have strong top-down regulations, both on national levels but also on regional levels. And what would be your advice once and what we see is that many of those measures, they actually have strong effects on people's lives, positive effects and negative effects. And one could be tempted to claim that to battle, for example, climate change, we need more strong top-down decisions. So what would be your stand based on what you've analyzed in the SMARTEES project? What would you advise local policymakers, national policymakers for the future after the COVID pandemic? How is social innovation after post-COVID? Who wants to go first with some ideas? Gabriele, do you have some ideas? Or no, Adina has unmuted, so you go first, and then Gabriele.
Yes, I'm not sure I will answer the second part of your question, which is how is social innovation after the pandemic? But I do think that a lot of the factors that we've identified in the SMARTEES project, the dynamics that explain acceptability and resistance, we can see in the pandemic, right? In the COVID pandemic. So, for example, I think one of the there's a strong reaction now against vaccines, and also against, there's a lot of contestation around the kinds of measures that were taken with active and also passive resistance, and also, some sector of population which is kind of indifferent, doesn't do much, but it's not exactly in agreement with what's going on. And I think part of that was that actually some of the same mistakes were committed, right? On the one hand, I think one of the things that was not done well was how this was communicated. So targeted communication strategies to particular concerns that citizens had, both for what confinement measures after the first wave, where everybody was in shock, how those were communicated, I think were really not targeted to anyone, and to particular concerns of people. And the same is happening with the vaccines. I think there's no real communication about that that is targeted. It's just kind of top down, and it uses the same arguments that only respond to a particular sector of the population. One of the recommendations I would personally have, also based on SMARTEES results, is that first of all, after the first shock stage, you would need a process where you actually involve citizens in more targeted communication, but also in kind of seeing and understanding, and maybe in certain parts making common decisions on how we should deal with this. In the same with that idea that citizens can actually understand what the pandemic is, right, and what that supposes, and the dilemmas involved in that. And then the other thing is, I would say the other recommendations I would have, it was done in a way that was very sort of, medically oriented and very technocratic in a way, right? But at the same time, it looked very non-professional in other ways. So working more in kind of inter-transdisciplinary teams would have been appropriate, because you could also consider things like well-being, psychological difficulty of decisions. These were important criteria. It was not only about, avoiding contagion, which was very important. We all agree with that, but there were more factors to consider in this, economic as well, as we all know. So I think there are a lot of lessons from SMARTEES that could actually be applied, also considering with the caveat that there was a necessity for rush at the beginning, but then in the second stage, this might not have been the case. So I think there's considerable room for improvement, and I haven't seen any of these debates going on. So it doesn't seem that there's a start for this.
Yes, thank you, Gabriele.
Well, I think that 3 points. The first one, I think that we have to consider the COVID-19 situation, and I hope that it will be this way, extraordinary situation, therefore like sort of conflict. It's absolutely clear that during this period, consensus with the diffused decision making is more difficult, that there are rules coming from the top, bottom up processes are difficult, etc. And this, of course, in this moment, it is more difficult to implement some of recommendation that came from our SMARTEES, but also from many other studies related to a wider decision-making process. But we have also to consider another thing, that COVID-19 situation probably increased the awareness of people on environmental issues. And therefore, when the COVID-19 situation will end, hopefully in a few months, 1 or 2 years maximum, probably people that will be involved in decision-making processes will be people more aware of issues like the ones that we discussed during the project. Therefore, it seems, according to me, now it is more difficult. Later it will be more easier to take into account the lessons from SMARTEES. We have also to consider a third issue, that there are, independently from the construction of consensus, but there are already some changes from COVID-19 situation. For instance, in Switzerland, we have analyzed so this in Zurich. There was an important increase in the use of bikes due to COVID-19 situation, work and bikes, and there was a sort of crisis in the use of public transport that was the core point in the Zurich mobility, strategy. Therefore, we have to consider these three things. First of all, we are in an exceptional situation. Second, after the situation, probably we will have an increased awareness. Third, in post-COVID situation, we will have already some changes that from conjunctural can become structural.
Yes, thank you, Gabriele, for these thoughts. I have another question going to all of you, and that is that in several of the presentations, it was quite clear that people that have an interest in the environment, that have an interest to develop the local quality of life, they are the drivers of the local social innovations. But not all people living in a neighborhood have a high environmental concern. So what can you say from your analysis of our cases? How does that develop over time? So what about these skeptics that think that, well, if we ban cars from our neighborhood, that would ruin the economy here, or people saying that all this talk about environmental pollution that is not really relevant or whatever. So you have these people living in a neighborhood. How do social innovation processes deal with that? Might they even be a way to overcome this skepticism in a different way than top-down measures? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a $1 million question, is how do you nudge the people that are less likely to be motivated by these environmental factors, and what are the factors that they would be motivated by? And my colleague Jed, I think he's actually working on a project that is following some cities that have really taken advantage of this time where mobility has changed, and they've changed their downtown areas. And I think it's going to be interesting to continue to follow these cities and look at the impacts that changing these downtown areas have made on maybe the economic factors that might motivate these people more to change the infrastructure of an area to make it more bike friendly. And even though my study actually indicates that these built environments make less of an impact on people's biking decisions, I think it would add more robustness to the question of, okay, does it depend regionally? So hopefully we can gain a lot from this social experiment that is COVID. because it's a very unique time, and some cities are making changes quite rapidly, and it's going to be interesting to follow those cities and see what kind of impacts actually come from those changes.
Yes, Adina, I can see that you want to add something.
Yeah, just briefly, I think we found 4 things I think that are important that could bear upon that question. One is find a common motivation that is beyond that, right? That is beyond that relates environmental concern with health, for example. That was a very powerful one in the cases, and also with some economic benefits as well, either related or not related to health. And for example, in the case of Barcelona, they were saying that once a study came out that related air pollution to cognitive performance of children in schools, there were flocking demands to have super blocks everywhere because of that problem, right? So that was when really that was a turning point in this story. So I think that's an important one. The evaluation of projects and showing those results to people, I think that's really important. So to make people aware of the kinds of benefits and also drawbacks. I mean, it goes both ways. So show benefits more clearly through evaluations, and show benefits through pilot projects that are of really high quality. I think that's another thing that we found. Victoria, yesterday we had one workshop with them, and they were saying that actually some of the areas where the projects were really high quality, nobody, after they saw the benefits of the pilot project, nobody dared to say we should go back to what was before, and nobody actually thought that was possible. While in projects that were not of that high quality, that was the case. There was much more contestation. And finally, prestige. So getting reputation as a city that is sustainable, getting prizes, getting that external recognition, we found to be really a powerful driver of also environmental awareness. So people become more environmentally aware by having this external mirror that says, your city is doing really great on a global scale on this.
Let me follow up this last thing that you said with a final question for the first part here. You said, and also in some of the other presentations, there was a mention that some of these social innovation projects actually build a local identity of we are front runners in environmental issues. Could you give some such examples so that you can make it tangible? How does that express or?
I give a quick example of the island of El Hierro further on, because they at the beginning were skeptical about becoming a self-sustainable island, and they were particularly concerned about losing economic opportunities because they have been historically deprived, right? Historically, there was a history of not having a lot of economic opportunities. And actually, when they started seeing, there was again this surprise to say, okay, we've become a model island. There's people flocking in and also scientists coming in to study our example. This has started to create a feeling that we are doing something that's really worthwhile as a community, and we are doing something that's great. Because of the recognition it got, but also because they started developing the concept that this is actually a valid economic model, not based on fast growth, but on sustainable growth, right? Through sustainable tourism and other kinds of opportunities that were more adequate for the island. So I think although this was not part of the discourse, so the economic opportunities were not prominent in the discourse, it was sort of a hidden understanding that this leads also to some economic benefits that are really important, and it doesn't have to be the model of exploding growth that is actually destructive. So I think there was one example of that.
They followed the example of Samsung in a certain sense.
Yes. Do you want to add something, Gabriele? You're unmuted. So
I add to what Adina said, but it seems that as far as I understood from the work she said, in El Hierro they followed something that happened in Samso some years ago, it seems to me.
Yes. So
perhaps we can say something that's similar also for the case of Groningen. I think perhaps Groningen as a biking city. Of course, this happened a bit before, of course, but this could be considered another example. Zurich less, in my opinion. It's more controversial.
Yes, thank you for this first round. We will return after a coffee break in session 8C with more insights into the other cases and with more insights also into the social modeling part or social simulation part of the project. So I'm happy to welcome you again in half an hour's time at 11. Have a nice coffee break.